Hi, so that is my pleasure to welcome you all to the next session of the morning entitled Personalism and American Ideals. I'm really quite excited at how well this session seems likely to flow out of the one we were just having. A lot of the things we talked about in the history of the development of personalism in politics and ideas of rights and so forth will lead us quite naturally in the discussion of American ideals. For those who don't know me, my name is Peter Mylander. I teach political science at Houghton College in Western New York. We have two panelists for you this morning. One we have met earlier in the week already, Jonathan Sanford. Dr. Sanford is the new president of the University of Dallas. He has published widely on philosophical topics and has made significant contributions, especially in moral philosophy, as in his book Before Virtue, Assessing Contemporary Virtue Ethics. Sanford is currently writing a book on virtue and education. He lectures widely to both scholarly and popular audiences on a variety of topics. Among his many professional affiliations, obviously the most important is that he is a trustee and associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project, but he is also a member of the executive committee and the executive council of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, a member of the Dallas Board of Legatus, a fellow of the Dallas Institute for Humanities and Culture, and a board member of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. Our second speaker this morning will be Jared Zimmerer. He is the senior director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. He holds an MA in theology from Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and he is pursuing a PhD in humanities from Faulkner University, where he is currently writing his dissertation on the personalism of Russell Kirk. In fact, I had the pleasure of hearing him present about that project this last week to the participants in the Hildebrand residency at Franciscan University. He resides in North Texas with his wife and 6 children. To begin, just a reminder once again that if you set your chat box to all panelists and attendees, you can continue the conversation with the entire group there in the chat. And if you have questions you would like to direct specifically to our panelists, put those in the Q&A and I'll be tracking those as we go along. So Dr. Sanford is going to start us off this time and then we'll move along. JJ, you want to go ahead and begin?
By all means, thank you, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. And it's such a joy to join Jared Zimmerer on this panel. This is sort of the North Texas panel of the Personalist Vision. So it's wonderful to be with him here and to be with each of you. Thank you for your attention. So I've got about 12 to 15 minutes from what I understand, and I'm going to try to do too much in that amount of time. And I hope that when we come back to the Q&A period, we'll have a chance to dig in a little more concretely with a few of these ideals. So here's the big idea that I want to present to you for your consideration. There are 3 parts to it. The first is that, in fact, we do have, as it seems everyone is saying these days, some significant fractures within our contemporary American culture. Significant problems of a social, moral, institutional, and religious nature. And I want to say a few things about those. The second part of my 3-part thesis is that, to speak very broadly, some of the reactions to those problems from both the left and the right are overstated to the point at which we might characterize them as throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'll say a few things about that. I know that's not a very precise formulation, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but I think you'll see what I mean by that soon enough. And then finally, I want to make a very brief case for the personalism of the American founders, particularly as evidenced in the Bill of Rights and the additional amendments to the Constitution. There, the personalism is not so much explicit as it is implicit by the protections that are ensured through those amendments. So to begin, indeed, we have a number of significant problems in our society, and I'll just frame them around 3. The first we might characterize as failures to respect personal dignity, and the most blatant of those are offenses against life, particularly in abortion and euthanasia, but there are other ways as well in which we make offense against life and strive to, as it were, violate on a fairly regular basis what I was talking about earlier in the week as the personalist principle, where we tend to use human persons as means and not as ends far too often, particularly for our own desire for perpetual life, it seems, and other desires that are askew. The second is Part of this failure to respect personal dignity, there are uneven applications of the law. That's much much is made of that in our contemporary news sources. Sometimes this might be motivated. It's thought by ethnic and racial tensions. Other times by demographic tensions. It's an age-old problem that it's hard for certain people to get an equal hearing before the law, and a lot of effort is being made to bring evidence to that effect before our public eyes. And then the third part of this failure to respect personal dignity, and one that we may not think of in these terms, is I'll characterize it as a failure to recognize the virtues of rational disagreement. So there's a tendency to quickly pigeonhole one's interlocutors, to put them into this camp or that camp, and to refuse to listen to the arguments that might make. Sometimes you might begin even half of a sentence, and it's enough to, in the minds of some, have placed you in a particular camp. They know everything about you. There's nothing more to be said. And we seem to be failing in our ability to articulate our perspectives, to argue our points. I saw a Cato Institute survey last year that I think the number was 64% of American adults are too afraid to voice their moral and political convictions in public to do so. So a kind of terror at the reaction to one's own personal opinions has silenced many Americans. So either you're silent or you're screaming, and this is not a healthy state of affairs. The second general category of fractures within our American fabric, I'll characterize as a host of failures to exercise personal liberty, right? It's central to personalism to recognize that we act from freedom. And far too often, it seems as though we are pleading with others to solve all our problems. I was recently looking at Ben Sass's book on the vanishing American adults. The application of personal responsibility to the cultivation of those habits that enable one to really flourish as a human being and to contribute to the public good are vanishing. And that is a significant problem, and I would argue a failure in personalism as well. And then finally, I'm not sure exactly how to put this point, but a perverted view of what it is to live well, whereby the prevailing thought seems to be that we should dedicate ourselves to preference maximization, right? So the good life is the life in which you maximize your preferences, achieve those particular goods, the pleasures that are most appealing to you, and you want to be unfettered in your pursuit of those. So those are at least three large areas of challenges within our contemporary framework. So thinking about responses to those challenges, and I wanted to focus especially on some of the challenges from Catholic contingents, but it's worth noting that for a long time there have been many, sometimes coming from a Marxist or otherwise socialist background, who advanced the claim that we're now, as it were, with all of these problems, reaping what we sowed at the very origins of our country, that the very principles upon which we stand constitutionally and in our Bill of Rights are flawed because of the underlying philosophical background. So most recently, there's been a lot in the news about the 1619 Project in the New York Times and what it entails. There's a fundamental truth that project is seeking to articulate, which is that slavery is indeed the original sin of the United States of America. I don't think there should be any question about that. And as we know from our Christian roots, original sin has lingering effects. And so we continue to struggle with the lingering effects of that original sin of our country. However, some of the arguments coming out of that project are to the effect that that there are no sound bases to the principles that organize the government that we comprise here in the United States. If we're to emphasize this notion of we, the people, that the very principles are flawed. And from the other side, there are similar conclusions being drawn by Patrick Deneen and his rejection of the philosophical and theological foundations of the American Republic. The integralists have a wide following today, and so Adrian Vermeule and others, Gladden Pappin, find themselves in this camp. And there's a certain appeal to the integralist project that if only we could have a more robust integration of church and state, with particularly the Catholic Church in that kind of political position of authority, things would be better. I can see why this appeals particularly to many young people, but I think from a personalist point of view, and indeed from lessons of our history, we can discern there to be a number of challenges to this appeal, not least of which is the potential of the violation of conscience. More significantly and less noticed, I think, is the great progress the Catholic Church has made in asserting her authority as supreme when it comes to matters of morals and religious practice. And by infusing, again, the church with temporal authority of a significant political sort, one runs the risk of weakening just that supremacy in the arenas of religious practice and morals. So those are on the side of as I characterized earlier, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And indeed, there really is a baby at the foundation of our country, as flawed as some of the founders were, fraught with that original sin of slavery, as our country's origins are. Nonetheless, there is a deeply, again, personalistic view of the human person. And the Bill of Rights are minimalistic, and the other amendments, I'm thinking particularly the first 15 amendments to the Constitution, they're minimalistic in the sense that they're oftentimes characterizing a kind of negative. They're pushing against potential violations of the human person. So if we go back to those areas of fracture and disarray within our contemporary American scene, you find within the amendments of the Constitution protections for life, for liberty. So certainly the First Amendment, but also the 13th and 14th are enshrining certain protections of the human person. The even application of the law, a number of amendments deal with this. And we ought to imaginatively put ourselves into the positions of those who were framing these amendments, who had been recently under British rule. So particularly Amendment 4, 5, 6, and 7 that ensure that one has to be able to have a proper trial. One can't be accused and not tried, and so on and so forth. And there's a fundamental encouragement for individuals to make their own case, as it were. First, in even framing changes to the law, people can bring those forward through the channels of government. As hard as that is sometimes, it's nonetheless open and available to each. And so a kind of encouragement to rational agreement, I think, memorialized in particularly the first, 9th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. There's certainly much protection of the ability to exercise personal liberty, self-responsibility in the First Amendment, and the various protections in the Second Amendment, the ability to defend oneself and to collaborate with others in doing the same, to protect against intrusions from our governing body should it become necessary. Protections of one's own home and one's own country. So the Third Amendment articulates a protection of one's own home, and then the ability to vote, and the mechanisms of voting enshrined, particularly in the 12th Amendment and others. So I'm running out of time, and there's a lot that can be pulled apart there. The case I'm making is these amendments are explicit protections of the human person and imply implicitly, that is, a deep personalism. But when it comes to that third area of challenge in our contemporary scene, that having to do with a flawed anthropology, where so many people seem to be dedicated to the precept that life is best measured by preference maximization, I think our Constitution and its amendments are in large part silent, because our founders were assuming a substructure of encouragement towards a life of virtue. And it is indeed, in many respects, that which has crumbled over the years, which ought to turn our attention towards the important task of educating, of raising our families well, of cultivating a view of human flourishing in which the exercise of the virtues is front and center. That's a life that is less appealing from the outset, but more enriching as one pursues it. So I don't mean to suggest that everything that one needs to solve every problem in our contemporary American landscape is there in the Constitution and its amendments, but indeed there's much that is good. And I think it's at our own peril that we would toss that out in our efforts to address particularly this richer anthropological vision that we need to hold before our children, our students, and our fellow citizens.
Thank you, JJ. That was great. Jared, your turn now.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, JJ. That was excellent and wonderful, and an honor to share a session with you. So good to be with you, and good to be with all of you today. So what I'm going to do is build a little bit off of JJ's presentation and think particularly of a specific American thinker. Russell Kirk is, I think, a quintessential American thinker that oftentimes in the kind of modern conservative movement, unfortunately, gets forgotten. They call him the father of American conservatism, but unfortunately, in many ways, his understanding of what conservatism is has gotten lost. And so in my reading of Kirk, I found so much of kind of personalist principles that he expresses in an American experience. Many of today's guests may not know Russell Kirk as a personalist. Maybe you know his political writings or some of his cultural critiques. In fact, Dr. Brad Berzer, one of the leading Kirk scholars today, only mentions this fact. He calls him a personalist twice in some online publications. However, Kirk used many personalist principles which really help critique the culture. Problems such as individualism, collectivism, materialism, rationalism, determinism, any of these other isms which are fundamentally grounded in ideology. He knew that ideology very quickly becomes a means of dehumanization because ideology replaces the person with an abstraction. Man is then judged as a means for a vague political, economic, or social vision of what he calls an impossible utopia. So Dr. Kirk was not a phenomenologist per se, or even he probably wouldn't claim himself as a philosopher. In fact, he was more of a Christian humanist, a historian, and a cultural critic, in large part concerned with the potential loss of what T.S. Eliot called the permanent things, those things that are deeply within the human person that needs transcendent reality, it needs wisdom, it needs truth. So Kirk's personalism was much more of a frenetic personalism, sort of the idea of practical wisdom in which the tradition and philosophical idea is in the background. But for him, the bigger question was always, what does this mean in everyday life? He was certainly not a pragmatist, but in light of kind of his hero, Marcus Aurelius, a lot of times he would focus in on what does philosophy have to do with particularly the good life. So in a way, this makes him particularly an American thinker, because even in his own words, the founding fathers, he says, realizing that politics is the art of the possible, they settled for sound security in social institutions. They were not closet philosophers, vainly pursuing the vision of a perfect society independent of human experience. And for Kirk, in many ways, that idea of human experience, we have to look at tradition and history as our guides. So for this presentation today, to be honest with you, it was a little difficult to kind of boil everything down into what I want to say, because Kirk wrote a veritable library himself. He wrote over 32 books on politics, economics, literature, education, and actually he made most of his money off of his ghost stories that he wrote. And so he also had a literary imagination himself. But for the interest of time, I want to focus particularly on two areas of Kirk's thought and how a great American thinker might be understood personalistically. And of course, those ideas are economic freedom and liberal education. So economic freedom is, of course, one of the kind of core principles of American society. Kirk states that at the heart of the theory of free economy lies the idea of competition. Something in human nature seems to call for the possibility of real victory and the possibility of real defeat. Competition makes life enjoyable because it allows for hope. And hope cannot exist without the idea of success or failure. So in other words, competition or economic freedom is a good human thing, whether in sports or a type of kind of competition with the self. It drives human persons to better themselves and strive for virtuous excellence. However, this drive must be done in light of the rules of the game. So in regard to economic freedom, Kirk was no proponent of laissez-faire capitalism. As for him, it represented much of the worst aspects of liberalism. In fact, Brad Berzer pointed out that he was especially taken with the papal encyclicals of Pius XI and Leo XIII, who certainly did not equate freedom or a free society with liberalism or capitalism. For Kirk, both of those isms were nothing more than kind of a false materialism, kind of heretical results of modernity, really distorting the idea of the human person. In many ways, a kind of Ayn Randian capitalism or a Marxist socialism dehumanizes the human person. So for Kirk, it was a support of free markets without falling into materialism, something that he expressed in a way that says that if a competition that has no moral checks can quickly become vicious. So he says that competition of any sort ought to be governed by conscience. Now, think here of Newman's kind of championing of the individual conscience, the freedom of free will and the ability to be convinced and assent to certain truths. And then within that, the umbrella of the rules of morality. So in other words, to state this personalistically, both the subjective experience of conscience and the objective value of social moral norms must coincide really for economic freedom to benefit the human person in a free society. Now, there are a lot of today who would like to push this kind of bland equality, but Kirk would state that if we remove competition, if we try to get away from certain economic freedoms, the other options are either altruism, which oftentimes ends up in kind of a utopianism and ignores original sin, or compulsion, i.e. forced employment or slavery. And Kirk adds that the use of compulsion to enforce work is incompatible with a free society and the concept of the dignity of man. Rather, the most important virtues in a competitive society are prudence and charity. So for Kirk, charitable competition, which understands the experience of the downtrodden and the need for certain social measures, keeps the economic mentality from becoming dog eat dog. Competition does not rule out love and compassion. He says successful competition makes possible successful charity. And the increased productivity of a competitive free economy gives society the surplus of goods and services with which to relieve the poor, the infirm, the disabled, the old, and even the young. Kirk was neither a fan of pure capitalism, as I said, kind of in this Ayn Randian sense, or any type of socialistic or communistic economic structure where he would certainly heavily disagree with Emmanuel Mounier. So for him, economics ought to consider the entirety of the human experience, and recognize the reality of original sin in our limitations to create any kind of perfect structure. Ultimately, for Kirk, an economics without love will destroy the humanity of a civilization. So Kirk also warned that free markets, while being a supporter of it, can certainly break down, particularly whenever they are despiritualized. So again, as an enemy of both kind of Marxist materialism as well as liberal capitalist materialism, kind of in the Benthamite understanding of that, he warned of what's called existential boredom. If all we're seeking for transcendence or purpose, if we start to define ourselves as kind of homo economicus, it will ultimately lead to an existential boredom, which can lead to kind of madness and ultimately decadence. So this kind of anthropological distinction of homo economicus will also lead to an uglifying of the civilization. So it de-beautifies. And Kirk was, of course, a champion of beauty, regardless of the cost, to be honest with you. So in many ways, Kirk agreed with Wilhelm Röpke's kind of third way economic proposal, in which Röpke does call man homo religiosus, which would promote free competition and self-sufficiency. However, Kirk finds himself in disagreement with Röpke, particularly in the more liberal concern for overpopulation, which is where he sees more of the influence or the understanding of economist Julian Simon, who saw human persons actually as the best possible resource for a flourishing humane economy. So again, as Brad Berzer explains, Kirk points out really three things that need to be understood for an economic structure which bends itself towards human flourishing and fulfillment. That being that man is not purely an economic being, that a transcendent order exists, and that life has purpose well beyond economic self-interest. He wrote a little book actually called Economics, Work and Prosperity, which was meant to be for high school students. And in it, he says, it is not machines that give us prosperity, it is the human mind and human habits that make all the economic difference. So in many ways, it's a championing of the free market without losing the individual human person and their rights and their needs and their experiences. So the second aspect of Kirk's thought in regard to kind of understanding him, again, as an American personalist, is the necessity of liberal education. And particularly, he states that the person is the philosophical end of liberal education. So he certainly pulled no punches. If you've read any Kirk, you know he's quite pugilistic at times, but very witty and very readable. But he certainly pulled no punches when discussing the problems of an education of use. He sees a problem with an education that creates kind of cogs in the wheels, or workers for the state, or human persons who are just treated for social production. In fact, he says that the chief service of the person, so in this organism, what he's talking about here is particularly the problems that occur whenever we start to indoctrinate, or schooling becomes this kind of, we're just educating so that we can use them in some other way, shape, or form. He says these social institutions or educational institutions have dehumanized themselves. They have ceased to give us young people with reason and imagination who leaven the lump of any society. They instead will give us a narrow elite governing a monotonous, declining society, rejoicing in a devil's Sabbath of whirling machinery. So rather, what he states is the primary purpose of liberal education is the cultivation of the person's own intellect and imagination. And he states very emphatically, for the person's own sake. So for Kirk, again, the philosophical end of liberal education is the human person themselves. So when an institution, and particularly an educational institution, becomes dehumanizing, particularly through indoctrination and ideology, human beings become a means to an end, and often find themselves worshiping false gods. And Kirk lists, of course, power, pleasure, honor, or money as those false gods. So rather, genuine education is something higher than an instrument of public policy. True education is meant to develop the individual human being, the person, rather than to serve the state. Its purpose is not to indoctrinate in civics, but rather to teach what it means to be a true human being living within a moral order. So again, the person has primacy in liberal education. Now, why this is important, particularly to society, is that he would also say that education does indeed have a social outcome. right? So from a society's schools comes future leadership, businessmen, priests, parents, and educators themselves. So for a good society to function, it needs well-educated people. If an education imparts wisdom, that wisdom will then spill out into the polis, which is an especially important need in a constitutional republic of free citizens. So Kirk writes that in its practical effects, liberal education works for order in the soul first, and then order in the republic. So if the individual is liberally educated and this affords him a degree of interior harmony, this will then permeate society in his dealings, his relationships, his community, and of course, his family. Society is generated through the actions and the interior life of an individual soul. So when society is off kilter, when we see decadence, it's often, as Kirk says, a reflection of the disharmony with the soul of the individual human person. So he actually describes the expectations of the founders of America to have men and women who have been trained to have what John Henry Newman called the philosophic habit of mind. So the purpose of this expectation was to nurture the new world with the best of the intellectual and moral patrimony of the old world. So this understanding of liberal learning coincides with the personalistic norm because it sees society as a collection of individual persons who exercise their freedom among other persons. So to form a person into an ideal citizen is not undermining his selfhood. Rather, it creates the conditions for possibility of a moral and good society while respecting the dignity and freedom of the individual. So Russell Kirk certainly knew the inherent dangers of an improper education as one of the clear sources of decadence in society. And I think if we look around at kind of modernity and some of the decadence we see, take a serious look at the vast majority of education out there. Improper education creates persons as slaves to their passions or these fleeting realities. So at the same time, being a champion of academic freedom, Kirk also makes an argument that all success in schooling depends upon the acceptance of necessary dogmas. So in other words, relativism is a means to slavery. If an education teaches you relativism, it's a means towards slavery to the passions. So he says, without some dogmata, without some eternal truth, the viewer is at the mercy of the seductions and banalities of the boob tube. Sound dogmata liberate us from enticement by fad and foible. So ultimately, the success of liberal learning is found in the freeing of the human person, which is fundamentally an ordering of the human soul practiced in virtue. So the end at which it aims is the good of the human person, which then again spills into the commonwealth and can grow entire generations of joyful, intelligent, and virtuous lives. So I think in many ways, in regard to this kind of conversation about integralism, I do think that Russell Kirk provides a much more balanced perspective of the necessity of cultural and religious realities, because he saw, much like Christopher Dawson, that culture is ultimately downstream from religion, as is politics. So religion, politics, culture, religion's at the top. And so he saw the necessity of really an inculcation of people into the religious truths and the eternal truths that are out there. That being said, he also understood that there are certain political realities that need to be attained, but it ought to be, again, towards a forming people in the good and virtuous way. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jared. We've got some questions coming in on the Q&A. I'd like to lead off with one thing myself and then see if I can pull some strands together from the questions that we're getting. It struck me that in different ways, both of your presentations point us back toward issues of culture. JJ, I'm thinking especially of a comment you made about how the initial amendments to the Constitution are maybe just silent about the underlying anthropology because the framers who wrote them probably could just take for granted a certain kind of conception of the human person, a sense of virtues to be pursued. Jared, obviously, you talk about Russell Kirk as a humanist, somebody interested in the permanent things, somebody interested in liberal education. Would it be an accurate characterization of your views, and this is really a question for both of you, to say that insofar as the American polity or American society today faces very serious challenges, those are not challenges inherent in the political order or the political ideals, but are in some sense deeper cultural challenges? I'm interested in knowing whether you think that if I'm putting words in your mouth or if that's accurate.
I would say that that's accurate, and this is something that it's not that we don't have political challenges, right? But the political challenges, I think, are ultimately manifestations of an underlying cultural problem, and it's a problem of education. I was grateful to hear Jared emphasize the significance of education so much. Education in a broad sense, right? The education in the family. One needs a family to have an education. One needs to be inspired by books that portray the heroic. One needs to. There's no shortcut to the kind of education that one pursues in a rigorous setting where you've got to read, you've got to write frequently, you've got to articulate your position, you've got to be ready for others to take shots at the arguments that you advance, right? So that kind of school of education, that a genuine liberal arts education on both the primary, secondary, and collegiate level can foster, right, has all sorts of civic implications when it comes to shoring up the weaknesses within one's local culture, right? We also have an absence of people who are really engaged in their local culture. So I mean, some of this is like small time politics, people sitting on city council, getting involved in affairs, but also just mixing up with each other on their front porch and engaging in conversation, right? Where those are problems that have been articulated sociologically and culturally for years now, but they haven't gotten any better, but are rather much worse, right? So how do I guess I'm doing two things. I'm answering your question, which was a straightforward question. I should have just said yes, and the other is to begin to make a case for how to repair some of that.
I would
making a pitch for the University of Dallas, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Without a doubt. That's my job.
Jerry, go ahead.
I would agree with JJ, of course, in many ways, and Kirk honestly would have no patience for people who think that politics is going to fix the problem. This kind of top-down way of fixing the issue is not really going to change the hearts of people. And in many ways, it can potentially even coerce them to do something rather than to truly be inspired to live the virtuous life. So for him, it was down to JJ's point, back to your local community, back to your local, even your family. I mean, we know what's going on in DC, but we don't know our neighbor. I mean, that's a major problem today. And we're kind of unfortunately living, because of, as much as I like social media, and I think it's done a lot of good, it's also done a lot of bad because it's created this anti-reality where we think that the national conversation that's going on in social media is what the same conversation is going to be with my neighbor. But that's not reality, really. I mean, to know and to love a human person face to face is very different than what you do on social media. But I do think that there's this kind of necessity to understand that Dawsonian way of everything is downstream from religion. And so what we've been worshiping in regard to materialism or power, pleasure, whatever it might be, I think our government reflects that. That's what we've got. And so I think in many ways, and of course I'm now going to be Bishop Barron's rah-rah guy. In many ways, we focus on political things rather than evangelization. And evangelization is what's going to actually change the hearts and minds and souls of individuals, which then creates a more moral society. So it's not an either or. There is a both and reality here, and we need good Catholics and to be in politics and doing their thing. But as individuals, as lay people, we certainly need to do our part on the ground.
I'm really struck by how both of those responses push toward a broader conception of education as sort of the formation of the person, which might happen at institutions like the University of Dallas, or hopefully Houghton College as well, but might happen through a ministry like Word on Fire, might happen in the family, other sorts of places. I want to follow up by pulling a couple of things from the Q&A together, but I think this really picks up on what you've been talking about, said in your presentations, and also on the preceding presentation this morning. There was a a pretty lively discussion going on in the chat, which I might have even contributed about some of these issues surrounding integralism. There are a couple of questions coming in about this, but I'd like maybe to kind of leave the label of integralism aside for a moment, because it turns into kind of a stalking horse in certain ways. A couple of questions that we maybe formulate something like this, particularly one that came in from Alex Plato, who had put some things very similar in the chat earlier. Should we be looking, do you think, for any kind of a third way between kind of modern liberal democratic order and what maybe appear to be undesirable alternatives we've seen over the last 150 years? Is there some post-liberal project that we should be aiming at, whatever we call that? Or should we be actually pretty content with the kind of order we've got? How would you respond to this question about should we aim at a post-liberal order of some sort?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I draw a lot from Alistair McIntyre. He's a tremendous influence on the way I think about these things, and I guess should we look for a third way on the level of the liberal democratic order, or something on the level of whatever we're going to call it, sort of a revival of the Habsburg dynasty, or who knows what, right? But those are looking at the big picture of things. I mean, one of the things I appreciate about the American founding and particularly its founding documents, which I think we sort of sometimes fail to appreciate, is just how minimalistic they are, right? And it creates that should leave space for us to build up our local community. So the wonderful book of Yuval Levin, A Time to Build, that came out a couple of years ago, I think gives us the right answer to the question. We ought to be shoring up our institutions as vehicles for promotion of a life of virtue, as opposed to platforms for the display of those who lead them. And therein lies our task, right? It's not a third way in the sense of a major thing over and above all institutions, right? So on the one hand, I think in terms of we've got to protect our ability to operate freely within the institutions that we care most about, right? And I want to encourage people to be caring most about their local institutions, their churches, their synagogues, their schools, and invest our lives there in such a way in which we're pursuing the truly human goods. And in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, Alistair McIntyre, I think, makes a compelling case for how one can identify and pursue those goods. But it's within the context of institutions that we do that, not superstructures. So I want superstructures to leave me sufficiently alone so that I can build up local institutions.
Thank you. Jared?
Yeah, and I would just build on that and just say that, as I mentioned in my presentation, one of the absolute necessary virtues in a free society is prudence. And what I come to see with a lot of these sort of post-liberal or integralist camps is there's an abstraction that they're operating on rather than reality. In many ways, as Dr. Miller mentioned this morning, how would we possibly change to an integralist society? There's not really in reality a way to do that without something that's a little bit more extreme. Instead, let's work with what we have. I think of Anthony Estlin talking about the Boethius option. Go into it and bring in those virtues of prudence and charity rather than power, right? So it's a matter of having that philosophic habit of mind that Newman talks about and bringing it into the culture around you. I love the idea of focusing in on social institutions, because in many ways those have broken down, especially over the past 20 to 30 years. And so to sacrifice of time and money and effort to create institutions that start to build culture around yourself, and to stop thinking about left and right, but rather in us. We're in this together, regardless of maybe our political differences. We're in this together as human persons.
Thank you. I couldn't help thinking, JJ, as you made the reference to the Habsburg monarchy. I actually had a I have a recently retired historian colleague who was a specialist on the Balkans who always said he was going to found a Bring Back the Habsburgs political party. Sorry, it's a another question that is, I think, related, but takes this issue into the realm of economics specifically. And Jared, I suspect there's a couple of things in the Q&A that were probably prompted by your discussion of competition in Kirk's thoughts. But JJ, also your description of the founding documents is minimalist. One way that minimalist is not saying a lot about economic systems explicitly. And so we have a few questions that are also, maybe we could say, asking about a third way. But I would reformulate it like this. I think that to what extent are we living in a world in which truly free markets, in which human beings come together spontaneously to meet one another's needs, in which those operate, and to what extent are we living in a world that maybe one of the questions describes as more bureaucratically, rationally managed? I think, for instance, of the difference between the label capitalism, which of course was given to Western economies by Karl Marx, criticizing them, or John Paul II's preference to talk in terms of market economies, something like that. Do we have well-functioning market economies, do you think? And if not, are there suggestions you would make about how to push us in that direction? Maybe, Jared, since you had brought this up in the context of Kirk, maybe you'd be willing to lead off with that.
Sure, and I'm certainly not an economist. Most of what I know about economics comes from Kirk. And so I would say if I was putting on Kirk's mind, he would say that we're much more kind of under the mastery of managerial big business at this point. However, that being said, American society still has one of the greatest opportunities for people to start businesses and to create self-reliant opportunities and to really get into the trade. And it's a matter of always thinking of how we can grow with the times, not to be anti-technology in regard to the use. I do think there are some issues going on with technology, but to realize opportunities along the way. Now, I know a lot of people tend to try to put Kirk in this distributist camp. I would say that he's not. In many ways, he's much more okay with free competition and a society of self-reliance that goes beyond the agrarian realities. And so, as far as a third way option, it's we're in this moment where there's about 4 businesses that run almost a lot of things right now. But again, there's still opportunity here. And so I would not want to create it as this kind of pure decadence or pure, it's no longer a free market. It is. But I do think we need to start recognizing the need to support our local communities on a much higher level. I think about do we know who actually gives us our beef and our milk? It's a little more difficult, but it is possible. There are those opportunities around us, and to support individuals who are trying to create businesses, even if that means a little bit of a financial sacrifice for ourselves.
So, Peter, your question is in part empirical, right? So, to what extent are we under constraint? To what extent are we free to form the kind of small associations that it seems so many people admire as part and parcel to a free economy? And here we're not talking about the capitalist superstructure. So, I mean, I've studied Marx, I've studied Ludwig von Mises, I've studied people in between those two extremes. There's a lot of theory in my lived experience. Now I'm in Texas. I moved from Steubenville, Ohio to Texas. The economies are very different, and a lot of that has to do with the kind of opportunities that the government structures allow for. So there's more freedom to start something entrepreneurial in Texas. That's part of it, but also part of it is cultural. One of the things that impressed me when I moved here, and I'd even forgotten was a thing, is when somebody is starting a small business and starts to do well, friends, neighbors, and others seem to actually be happy for that person, and that's not always the case, right? So there can be a kind of concern that somebody's outdoing somebody else. That's the hallmark of a certain culture that's been marked by in the case of the Rust Valley of the Ohio Valley, the declining salaries over many years as steel mills and other mills associated with them started to dry up. So it's not just the government structures. I mean, the fact we don't have a state, we don't have state taxes. We've got other incentives here in Texas that don't exist in other states. In some ways, it's good, but there's a cultural milieu that encourages that or doesn't. That's also part of the mix.
I feel as though I should call Michael Matheson Miller back on to give us at least kind of 2 cheers for globalization or something like that. But also would be sure people notice there are some good reading suggestions coming in the chat for folks who want to pursue that issue further. We've got a few minutes left. It's been a pretty positive session about American ideals. Can I push the two of you to wonder is there anything in particular about American ideals, the American identity, American culture that you would want to point to as a problem? This is, we mentioned the original sin of slavery, right? But is there something else perhaps that?
Yeah, well, so no, thanks for that question. And for much of my life, I've emphasized challenges which are still there, particularly individualism, a tendency to it's not accidental that preference maximization has become so dominant. I do think that there are features of liberalism that give expression to that and work with a truncated anthropology. I do think the way in which we think of religion as a purely private affair and that it ought not to be integrated into one's public discourse is a major problem. So lately I've been feeling like I've got to push back a little bit and say, hey, wait a second, there is some good there, but without a doubt, some of the very American ideals that I admire. I recently reread for maybe the 7th time with another set of children the Laura Ingalls Wilder series, and I was struck by, on the one hand, the radical individualism and frontierism that characterizes Pa Ingalls, and how admirable it is in many respects, but isolating in others. And we're a far distance from that Aristotelian recognition that there's something about the polis that's most fitting to the human being, and something about the human being that most flourishes within a polis, right? So those are elements that I think American ideals are struggling with, and in part because they give expression to them. So,
Yeah, the 2 areas I would focus on that again kind of comes from this radical individualism is this culture of self-invention, sort of seeing the self as something that's malleable, sort of this kind of, I am a brain, but not necessarily a body, therefore I can change whatever I want. I can define myself by however I want, regardless of where I come from, my experience, my family, any of that. And then the second aspect is the breakdown of the family. I think that does come from a radical individualism. And I do think there have been some governmental moves that have helped support a lot of that breakdown of the family. And as the family goes, so goes society, says Mother Teresa. So those would be the 2 areas I would probably focus in on that really misunderstood in regard to the American founding have led towards this culture of individualism.
It's interesting how both of you, I think, in very similar ways, point towards this issue at the core of American identity, the place of individualism, right? That it's both a strength and a weakness. I even think of, JJ, you asked us to look at the first 15 amendments. If we had time, I'd ask you why you stopped with 15, because I think you could play out the theme right after that. You see voting rights for women, and you see the voting age lowered, and the end of poll taxes, and the direct election of senators, right? A number of things that kind of push forward that individual equality. And people have asked for reading suggestions all along the way in the chat, and so I'm going to just throw out one of my own again. But book called Democracy in America is really on exactly that tension, right? And to me, really, when I first encountered it, I thought it was sort of the second tier of political thought, and I've come back to it over and over again over the years. I've decided, no, it's one of the really great works of political thought. Let me ask one, this is a very specific and a very narrow question. It's really for Jared, although, JJ, if you've got a suggestion, feel free, but it was in the Q&A, and it's a short one, so it's a good way to take us out. You've read a lot of Russell Kirk. As you said, he wrote a lot of things. Where would you recommend people start if they're interested in looking into Russell Kirk?
Sure, I would start either with The Prospects of Conservatism, which is a little bit shorter of a book, but it gives a really good idea of kind of his essence of conservatism, but then also the collection of essays just called The Essential Russell Kirk that was put together by George Penichas, I think is how you say his last name. That's an excellent way to kind of see his thought over time as well. So you see him writing as early as he did all the way up to the 90s in that, and it's broken down in different sections in a really great way to read it. So you can even not necessarily do it cover to cover if you don't want to, because it's a really thick book, but well worth reading.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we got a number of people in the audience who are going to be moving into small groups now. And so they've got about 3 minutes to grab themselves another cup of the coffee that Michael just referred to in the chat there. I want to thank both JJ and Jared for really entertaining, stimulating presentations, giving us a lot to think about. I do think it flowed really nicely from the session this morning. So thanks to both of you, a virtual round of applause. And to those in the audience, look forward to seeing you all again here for another morning of good discussion tomorrow. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.